Hello everyone. I'm going to present how Inuit qaujimajatuqangit fits well into Arctic char research. In Nunavik, Arctic char is harvested all year long, and it's an important food resource, as nearly 80% of the population rely mainly on country food. And Arctic char, which are fish which are mostly Arctic char, is the second source of country food. So people have a really good knowledge of the fish life and of the environment where they live. I'm working on the habitat of the Siren Arctic char in fresh water. Here you can see a nice red one ready for spawning, for reproduction. And in the pictures, you can see the different rivers that they use for spawning. The objective of my project is to do the link between the preference of the fish and the physical characteristics of the river. It's what we call fish habitat model. I'm working with 3 communities of Nunavik, which are Kangirsuk, Tasiuyak, and Kangirswalujwak. And I'm working with people in different ways. I have done formal interviews. It was mostly with elders, but also with more younger person, but who were really experienced. And I have done field work with guides who were mostly experienced hunter, and they teach me a lot of things on the fish. Some of them also did winter habitat monitoring last winter. It was really interesting. There is a lot of informal discussions. I'm trying to give regular feedback of what I'm doing and to ask for validation of the hypothesis and interpretation. And I'm in the learning process on how to communicate well, and it's still a work in progress. So the more I will get scientific knowledge, the more I will be able to share more with communities. People use really large areas for hunting and fishing. So here you can see the different, in pink, it's the areas where people have really good knowledge of the fish habitat. It can be the winter sites, the spawning sites, where there are some predators. So these large areas couldn't be covered by researchers for sampling, even with a large budget, helicopters, and a lot of time, because we often do sporadic field work. So an interesting thing is to do sampling and monitoring by hunters. We have tried it last winter. It was exploratory to see if we could see some results, if we could have some insight about the fish habitat during winter. And it was really interesting because we had good data and it was easy to do. And the fishermen who were doing that while they were fishing became curious of what they were going to find, because they had some underwater camera, so they could see the fish when there were some. And on another aspect of the more qualitative, the large areas of the land that people covers show different diversity in environment, and it shows different behaviors of the fish. So for example, the Siren Arctic char are spawning in gravel bed, rocky beds in Nunavik, and they don't really build nests. They just let the eggs drift with the current, so the eggs are going behind the rocks. And in Kangirsuk, on the left side of the map, there are 2 large rivers, really dynamic with strong currents, with a lot of spawning sites. And the fish are spawning in sandy little bays that are side of the river. And they are building nests in the sand, which is really unusual. So it's the kind of behavior that we couldn't be aware of without the Inuit knowledge. And on a more broader scale, you can also see some behavior that are more generalized. For example, the migration pattern is quite the same on the 3 communities. With the really good knowledge that people have of the land, they are able to locate precisely the different sites of interest. For example, for me, the spawning sites. So they have drawn on maps many spawning sites that they knew. And here you can see an example. The spawning sites are the yellow spots you can see. And I put them behind, in front of a satellite view. And it's really interesting because we can see some pattern of the spawning site that the fish are using different specific river morphology. And this kind of pattern that we can see on a more broad scale with the satellite view, people were not that aware of. So we can set some hypotheses on why the fish are choosing this kind of geomorphology. And people are really, really good to describe precisely the whole fish life, which is really insightful, but also the specific sites, especially for spawning, because the fish are spawning year after year at the same place, and people are fishing at this place for generations. So they have an observation of the sites and the river, which is really useful for habitat modeling. So they are able to describe the characteristics of the river, the velocity, the depth, the kind of river, and it's a qualitative description. So for example, they can say that with moderate velocity, it brings a good habitat. And we are able to take this qualitative description and to use it into a mathematical model by transferring the qualitative value into quantitative value. So I will show an example. It's what we call what is called fuzzy logic. I will just explain really shortly so that you know that it exists and it's kind of easy to use. Here, you can see an example with the velocity. Velocity can be described as slow, moderate, or fast, and there is a continuum between the three characteristics of the velocity. And if you go on a field and you measure velocity, for example, at 0.4 meter per second, you can say that it's moderate, but you can also say that it's slow. So with the combination of the two, you can have a habitat suitability index, which is a numerical value of the suitability of the sites for the fish. So it's just that we can use the qualitative description into quantitative description for habitat modeling. Also, as knowledge is transmitted on the land by more experienced people, there is a continuity in the observations, so people are good to see when there are some modification in the environment or some trends. So for example, there is more and more vegetation on the riverbanks. Like 20 years ago, the bush were 1 feet, 2 feet high, and right now they are 4 feet, 5 feet, and it's difficult to access the fishing sites. There is also less rain in summer for the few past years, not this summer, but the last few past years there were less rain, and some days are really warm, so it impacts the river temperatures, especially for the small one, the small juvenile. And in fall, the river becomes more dry. So all these trends can impact the fish habitats. For example, the spawners have difficulties to go up the rivers sometimes, and some rivers are even no longer used for spawning. In conclusion, Inuit knowledge is really rich because of the detailed, specific knowledge, the long-term observations, and the broad scale of the land used. The qualitative information can give insight on how the different aspects of the environment are interconnected with the fish life. It brings some more complexity on a positive way. We can use the qualitative information to build hypotheses, and we can also take the qualitative information and transfer it into quantitative information, which is useful for the habitat study. And I think the most interesting aspect of Inuit knowledge is that it's transmitted by storytelling, by discussions. So we learn a lot on Inuit culture, and it's really fun. And it's how we build trust and confidence to work and share knowledge and build new knowledge together. Thank you for your attention. If you have any comment or question, I will be happy to answer.